Happy Thursday. It is I, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and this is the Podcast Lawyer Live. I'm glad to be here. You may hear a lot of echo in my room today, and that is because, well, I had a flood. I had a pipe just up over there in the ceiling, a hot water pipe coming through the ceiling of my office, the floor above, burst open on Thursday last week, and I might have I went live last week because of that. Anyway, it soaked the drywall on the ceiling and two of the walls here in the office. So about a fourth of the room has been gutted and dried out with fans and heaters and dehumidifiers and all the good stuff. And I'm in the midst of waiting for my insurance adjuster to do their thing and get the new drywall and then paint, and we're going to redecorate the office a bit. I've got some interesting ideas. I'm excited and happy about it, but it means that in the meantime, everything has been stripped off the walls, the shelves, the paintings, the various things that break up that reflection. So I've got lousy sound here in the office. And I've had two podcasts to record this week. It's been interesting. Anyway, thank you for bearing with me and for listening today, even though it's a little reverberant. And today we're going to be talking about ownership structures in podcasting and compensation for your team and those kinds of things. And this all stems from a question that came up in one of the podcast groups not too long ago. And before I get into the substance of what I want to talk about, I will invite questions. So anybody who has any other questions they'd like to ask, I'm happy to stick around and answer those. And drop a note in the comments and say hello. Let me know you're here. I'd love to give you a proper greeting. And I do see a few people here watching, so thanks for being here. Do say something in the comments just so I know you're here. But what I'm going to start off with is this subject, this topic of ownership and compensation for podcast teams. So the question that came up in one of the groups was looking for advice. I do a few podcasts with friends. They're on the show. I do everything else, production, social media management, booking guests, etc. I'm fine with this arrangement as they are, but if we ever get to the point where monetization is possible, what should we do? Obviously, the costs associated with hosting and whatever else are priority, but if it actually starts making money, how does one compensate your co-hosts, etc.? Should I establish this as a business? Should they be contractors? What do they get paid? Is anyone at this point in their podcast journey where they have to consider this? I would like to have some ideas and some groundwork laid before we get there. So, and he says, look, my friends are going to be fine with whatever we do. This is a very amicable thing we have going. It's not about anything other than advice on how to approach them, entirely about the how of the business side, what makes sense, what others are doing. Well, I'm going to say it isn't any of those things now. It's very amicable now. When money starts coming in, when it becomes a monetized thing, that may change. I'm sad to say, money changes everything. Business, friendships turn into business relationships, and those things can get uncomfortable. Hopefully they don't. You know, I mean, in a perfect world, they never would. But that's something to be mindful about. Okay. I just had something strange happen on my screen, so bear with me for one moment while I get this. Okay. So what I want to do is start with a basic discussion of how ownership works and how the law views things when people come together on a project to work together. When two or more people come together to do business, and when I say to do business, I'm talking in the most general, broadest terms. You may not be thinking of your podcast as a business. It's a hobby, a fun thing, but nevertheless, you are engaging in some kind of an enterprise. You're doing this thing together, and the way the law looks at it is to say, when two or more people come together to do those things, they are deemed partners. And the default rule in every state in the United States is partners are equal co-owners and bear equal responsibility and liability and risk for the partnership's activities unless there's something specific that evidences some other intention. So usually that would be something like a written agreement, a partnership agreement that says, hey, we're dividing things unequally. Or it could say we're not partners, we're not co-owners, those kinds of things. So that's the business structure side of things. So the back to the question, should I form this as a business? I'm going to say technically you already have. What you've done though is done it informally in a way that's going to be subject to the default rule. That is, everybody's a co-owner, everybody's equally responsible for all of the expenses as well as the upside and any liabilities and so on. Now that may or may not be your intention. So should you form it as a business? I think probably. Should you do it as an LLC or corporation? There's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be done, but at the very least you want to do a partnership agreement or some kind of a memorandum of understanding that addresses who owns what, who's responsible for what, and those kinds of things. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But the other side of this is copyright ownership. Now, copyright ownership is going to look a lot like, and this is true of all intellectual property, but mainly the copyright, it's going to look an awful lot like partnership law. When two or more authors come together to create a work that is an original expression that's recorded and fixed in some tangible form and own it, then therefore create something that's subject to copyright law, they are deemed joint authors and therefore joint owners of undivided interests in the thing, the whole work. And the courts really do take a look at the intention of the parties, and they try to figure out, did the parties intend to be joint authors, or did they intend to bring separate works together to combine them as, but retain their individual shares of authorship. And this comes up in collaboration agreements and stage musicals and co-writing screenplays and all those kinds of things. Usually it looks like it was intended to be a single unitary work. And certainly a podcast episode, if you've got co-hosts and guests and things like that, looks like everybody intended to make one podcast episode, not 10 little things that all got lumped together somehow. So joint authors, joint owners, co-owners, again, unless there's a clear intention otherwise. So once again, I'm going to say, you want to make sure that evidence is clear. Best way to do that is with a written document. Now, the fact that you're paying for everything, you're handling all of the other nitty-gritty, the social media, you pay for the hosting accounts, everything's in your name, all those kinds of things. Is that enough evidence of the intention not to be partners, not to be co-owners? Well, I'm going to say maybe, but maybe not, because it's not just the one person's intention, it's all of the parties' intention. And, this isn't a situation where you can necessarily refute the fact that, or the idea that the intention was to create this thing jointly just because you opened the account. Someone has to put it in their name, right? So unless you have a business entity set up. So I'd say the other thing is that one of the members of the group could say, well, wait a minute, you contributed the cash and you contributed that work part of it, using your email address and opening the accounts in your name. I contributed too. I showed up every week to do the show. I'm a guest, I'm a co-host, and my sweat equity counts as well. So we didn't intend to be separate. We intended this to be a co-owned thing. That value contribution, I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't going to own it or get paid for it. So does that mean, I don't know, does it mean anything? Well, it means joint and several liability and joint shared ownership of the risk as well as the rewards. So if you intend to do it that way, then the next question, that is to be joint owners, co-owners and partners in the thing, then the question becomes, is it an equal split or an uneven, disproportionate split? And if so, what's the split look like? And again, it's going to come down to what is the evidence about what the split was supposed to be. So again, it's time to start thinking about getting these things in writing. Merely the evidence of how much one party contributed relative to the other, that counts, definitely, it's useful evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the intention was that they be unequal shares of profit. It may have just been, okay, you'll lay out the cash now, but we'll share in the profit and you'll take my share of that, later on. You even it out in the balance of things later on. So if the partners are intended to be joint authors, then you've got to go further and figure out what's the split. Accounting in a partnership generally means, and in collaborations as well, that the partners are sharing in the net proceeds of things. So everybody contributes what they contribute. Then you take the gross revenues and you take out all the costs and you reimburse the people for the things they've contributed, and then you can divide up what's left equally or unequally, whatever it takes. Partnerships are supposed to maintain a capital account for each member of the company, and that tracks their contributions as well as their shares of earnings and figures out how much each person owns or how much of the profit each of them is getting. So what happens though is you get into this and everything's going along fine, especially when there's not a lot of money at stake. And then somebody gets disgruntled. Somebody decides, I need to leave. Maybe they're not disgruntled. They just can't afford to invest the time anymore. They're having a kid and they need to devote more time to that, or they've gotten a promotion at their job and they need to focus on their work, or they've lost their job and they need to find a new job. All those kinds of things. So what happens when someone quits or dies or gets unhappy about something or whatever, right? Who then owns what's left, and how does that person get out when they're responsible for part of the costs as well as the upside, right? If they're a partner, they're on the hook for it, right? And so you get into all these sort of strange questions of how do we get somebody out of the enterprise and allow it to keep going? Normally, if you're partners, one partner leaves or dies or whatever, the partnership dissolves. And then you have to figure out, what do you do with all the assets? Who owns the podcast? Who owns the title? Who owns the content for all those episodes that you've made? Who owns the RSS feed? Because that's your audience, right? And who owns the hosting accounts, the email accounts, all the email addresses on lists, your social media accounts, as well as all the physical assets? Who gets to continue the show and the business? Let's say you've got two people doing a show together, and one of them gets unhappy and says, I'm done with this. I'm done with you. And goes off and says, okay, but I'm doing the show. And the other one says, no, I'm keeping the show. You're the one who's leaving, right? So lots of issues come up really easily in these scenarios. So assuming you don't want that co-ownership scenario to be the default that applies, you have to do something in order to make that clear. So how do you do it? Well, you figure out a compensation structure. What are the relationships going to be? What's that compensation going to look like? And if you are, do you even need to do a compensation? If someone's willing to volunteer just because it's fun and it's a hobby and, hey man, it's your show, but go ahead, we'll do it and it'll be good for me as long as it lasts, but you don't owe me anything, that kind of thing. That's the way my podcast is with my co-host. We made it very clear from the very beginning, hey, it's my show, you're the co-host for as long as we decide to keep doing it together, but it's my show, right? So she doesn't get paid. I mean, if we make a profit, I will share with her, of course, but we sort of view it as a marketing thing for our practices, our law practices. So we're not too worried about profit so much as just keeping costs down and doing it. We do have some sponsors and it sort of defrays our costs. In any event, if you're going to do a compensation structure, what's it going to look like, right? Now, maybe it's just you decide, okay, I'm still going to give you a percentage of the profit, but I own it. It's my show, but because you're my co-host, you're going to get a percentage of the episode of the profits. Well, what happens if co-host sticks with you for the first 100 episodes and then leaves, and then in episode 120, you start turning a profit? All those first 100 episodes had something to do with getting you there, building an audience. So does the co-host have a claim for some of the profits, even though they're no longer on the show? You got to think all this kind of stuff. It's crazy stuff, right? So figure it out. Maybe it's just you allocate a certain number of dollars per episode to the compensation of the co-host. Even if you can't pay it up front, you defer it. Make it a deferred contingent payment that's due to that person for each episode they've been in. That could be, relative to the dollars or who knows what. The fact of it is the dollars generally start small and grow. So you could say, hey, for the first year, we're going to deem each of us getting $50 an episode or whatever it is, and that's the dollar amount. And then we'll defer that until there's money coming in and you're good to go. Or it could be contingent, based on certain milestones happening. You're only going to get paid per episode if these things happen. Or it's a percentage of the profit. That's fine. What about a floor? Is there a minimum number? Or is there a maximum number? Right? If you're the one incurring all the costs and doing all the work, and your co-host shows up twice a month and records episodes, do you really want to give them, 20% of all the profits? If the profits become big at some point, are you paying them disproportionately too much? And could you be paying disproportionately too little? So you got to think about that. Or you could just do a bonus. At the end of the year, you'll figure out what makes sense and you'll divvy things up and call it a day, right? So there's lots of different ways. There is no one way these things are done. Now, if you are podcasting in the form of if you're a network, for example, you're going to hire these people and really make it a hire of the person. And you can still do those deferred compensation deals, but you got to make sure that everything is very clear. The point here is I want you to get it in writing. Have clear expectations and set forth clear expectations, not just about the money, but what are they supposed to do? What are the duties? What are their performance standards? Do they have to do well? What about sharing costs and expenses? If they're sharing costs and expenses, how are you going to calculate profits? What's the math going to look like? What gets deducted and what doesn't, right? Maybe there's expenses that you don't think should be deducted, like travel expenses or going out to parties or something like that. You could call that a business expense, I suppose. Some industries do that. So figure out what's going to be allowed and what's going to not be allowed as business expenses. What happens if something happens? Deal with what happens if somebody quits. What happens if somebody dies? What happens if somebody can no longer do their job? What if somebody just doesn't do what's expected of them? What about all those what if scenarios? Try to address those in the document. And I'm going to say it's not a question of if, it's going to be a question of when. Something is going to happen at some point where you need to figure this stuff out. This document, this hiring, co-hosting, or partnership agreement, whatever it is, whatever structure you decide on, is going to be your prenup that helps you figure out everything you need to worry about in case there's ever a breakup. So the podcast prenup is something that I want you to think about. Now, I know it's not comfortable. It's like thinking about dying. Nobody wants to write their will because they're worried because it forces them to think, but what happens when I'm dead? Who gets my stuff, right? Same thing comes up here, but this is important planning stuff for your show. It's good for you, it's good for your audience, and it's good for the co-hosts as well. So that's the kind of thing. And I want to encourage you, talk to a lawyer about this if you have any doubts. This is not templated stuff. You're not going to find your podcast prenup co-host agreement on LegalZoom. Now, I offer some forms and templates, and I do try to provide a co-host agreement. It covers the basics in the most plain vanilla way, and that may be perfect for you. But if there's anything unusual about your scenario, one party bearing all the costs, for example, we have to do some adjusting. So I do want to say, get some advice, talk to some lawyers, talk to other business people, talk to other podcasters, and find out what they're doing. I think you're going to find that many of them haven't thought about this at all, and that's a dangerous scenario. One other caution I want to give is be careful about casual mentions or casual discussions that might lead one or the other party to conclude that they're a partner when that isn't your intention. Again, intention is the important component here. I'm thinking of a particular scenario where a fellow who had a network of shows created one show around a particular TV series, and he was doing the show every week, and then he decided to bring on some co-hosts, and eventually one of those co-hosts sort of took the lead role, and he became, and the founder of the show became sort of a second chair, if you will. And eventually they ended up having a disagreement and just a disagreement over how they were going to monetize the show. One wanted to sponsor and one wanted to do sort of the Patreon crowdfunded kind of model. And they were back and forth about it. And finally, the guy who had started the show said, you know what, it's your show. Go, whatever you want will be fine. It's your show. Let's just leave it there. Well, it's your show. This was in a text message exchange back and forth. That was interpreted as it's his show. You own it. Go and do what you want with it. And so what he wanted to do was take it off the network and say goodbye and make it his. And so we had that dispute about all of the different components, the title, the content, the feed, the hosting account, everything, access to the website, access to the Facebook pages, all those things, and of course that audience. Now, my client, the host of the show, the original founder of the show, he didn't intend to stop doing the show. He intended to let the other guy take the lead. But what ended up happening was a long, drawn out, took about a year of back and forth to finally resolve and settle what could have been a very difficult, expensive lawsuit. So that's the kind of thing where you have to get these things in writing at the beginning so you don't end up spending tons and tons of time, energy, money, and resources making things work when there's a disagreement or dispute. They were perfectly good friends at the beginning, didn't stay that way. So that is my little talk for today on ownership and compensation of co-hosts and other members of your team. I see that Brian is here and Jay is here. You weren't late, Jay. You got in right as I was getting started, which, hey, this is not appointment television. I understand that. So thank you for being here. Does anybody have any questions? I see I've got some people watching. If you have a question or a comment, I would be delighted to chat. I see that Dominique is watching and Nelson is watching, and who else is here? Jordan is watching, it looks like. Do I have any questions? Anybody have anything to say? I've been ranting as usual for a little bit now, and I'm about to say thanks for watching and sign off, but before I do, I'd just like to, take any questions. I'm having an interesting conversation with folks around some ideas we're having about the music issue, and been talking about the First Amendment free speech stuff. In fact, I'm going to be on the new media show this week with Todd Cochran and Rob Greenlee. Rob was kind enough to invite me on the show, so I'm looking forward to that. That's Saturday morning at 9, by the way. Tune into that. Let's see. Brian asks, how do you handle situations with occasional guests? Well, as I always say, as I preach, you got to use a release with your guests. And I mean, have them sign it every time really would be ideal, or, express that they understand that every time they appear, they'll be subject to the terms of this agreement. That release that I put out at podcastrelease.com includes a statement that there is no compensation, right? And that the show producer owns the content. That's the way I would handle it. But certainly, again, get something in writing, get a clear expression of the understanding that this belongs to you, the host, the creator of the show, and the guest is not a co-owner. Jay says, shared with quite a few groups and hoping people can find value in my sessions. They are valuable. Oh, yeah, well, thank you, Jay. I like to think it's valuable, and I do get a lot of people watching on replays and things like that. So I'm really happy to be here doing this kind of stuff. I view my role as an educator and informer, as well as a lawyer and service provider. So power comes, knowledge is power, information is power, and I'm here to empower folks. So I'm happy to help draw up those contracts when the time comes, but even if I don't get to write it, I hope you'll do something and get it in writing so that there's a clear understanding of things. I think with that, I'm going to say thanks for watching. Unless there's another question or comment, I'm going to give it another, 20, 30 seconds. I think we have about a 10-second delay based on what I'm seeing here. So if no other questions, I'm going to wrap it up and say thanks for watching. Glad to have been here with you today. And Brian, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. All right, I will see you again next Thursday, hopefully in a renovated and more acoustically appropriate room before the hopefully the aftermath of my little plumbing disaster will be resolved by then. So I'll see you again in a week when the podcast lawyer speaks live. Have a great night.